one of the most compelling features of Spring Boot, one of its biggest benefits has to be auto configuration. With just a few lines of code, you can spin up a RESTful API that persists data to a backend database, interacts with a Kafka queue, does Spring AI, and even renders everything onto a web browser. In fact, I've done something very similar to that in this example that I worked through in a few of my other tutorials, with just a few lines of code here in the Spring application class, with almost no code in the repository class, with minimal code in a controller class, and just a few properties configured. Oh, and yeah, a verbose Java bean with lots of setters and getters, but let's not talk about that. But with just that minimal amount of code, I can spin up a web browser and actually get data from that back-end database and display it, in this case, in a JSON format. It's incredibly easy, it's incredibly simple, and it makes your life so much easier as a software developer because you don't have to worry about all these low-level configurations. You can concentrate on the business logic and getting your application working. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com, and I have to be one of the world's biggest Spring and Spring Boot advocates. And I've always thought that auto configuration was this magical and mysterious thing, but it's really not. And I want to show you exactly how auto configuration works. Now, I know they say you should never reveal a magician's secrets, but what I'm going to show you in the next couple of minutes is exactly how auto configuration works. I'm going to show you how to use auto configuration with Spring Boot and even use it in an application that's not using Spring Boot. I want to show you exactly how it works by maybe going into some of the Spring source code, and don't get intimidated because it's actually super straightforward and super easy. I want to show you all of the things that can be auto-configured. I'm going to show you a list of about 800 things. And then I'm going to show you how to figure out what's being auto-configured in your project and what's not. For that matter, I'll show you how to turn auto-configurations off because sometimes they can get in the way. And then finally, I'm actually going to create an auto-configuration of my own. I'm actually going to show you how you could implement an auto-configuration, get Spring to pick up your own auto configuration when Spring starts. And you know what? It's really not that hard. It's actually pretty simple. And that might actually be the real magic with Spring Boot. But starting off, what we're going to do next, we're going to take a little bit of a look at how Enable Auto Configuration works by looking at how we might interact with a backend database and get a database connection. And that is what we're going to do next. So kicking off this Spring Enable Auto Configuration tutorial, a couple of things I just want to mention. First of all, the only thing I've got installed on my machine is the Eclipse Spring Source Tool Suite edition that comes with the JDK, Maven, Gradle, and everything you need to build and run a Spring Boot application. Don't even have Git installed. I don't even have a separate JDK installed on my machine, just Spring Source Tool Suite. And I also installed MySQL because I want to show you how to configure a connection to a database here. And there's nothing really that interesting about MySQL here. I've got a schema called Rochambeau, a table called score, and in that score there's one record. And as you can see, that one record has 30 wins, 20 losses, and 10 ties for record number 1. Those 30 wins are going to come in handy in a moment, so keep note of that. The other thing I want to mention is that, Spring auto configuration is a fairly advanced topic. So I'm going to be taking a look at some maybe slightly advanced Java code here. Like this first example where I want to show you how Enable Auto Configuration works is a good example. Now, if this code is manageable for you, then this whole tutorial is going to be a breeze. But there's some advanced stuff in here. And actually, let's take a look at how auto configuration works in this example. I've got a Spring application here. The Spring application implements command line runner, which means I've got a run method that I can use to test my code. I've got a data source, autowired in. A data source is a connection pool. It allows you to get a database connection, and from a database connection, create a JDBC statement object. And from that, you can execute an SQL query, and that'll give you a result set. And then you can loop through it and get the results. It is real basic Java JDBC code. No repositories, no JPA, just the fundamental Java 101. And in fact, what I just mentioned there is exactly what happens in the run method. As you can see, AutoConfiguration from Spring, when this application runs, is going to create behind the scenes magically for me a data source. It's going to auto-wire that right into this application. And then when that run method kicks off, well, we're just going to say, hey, data source that Spring is auto-configured for me, get me a connection, create a statement object, pass select star from Rochambeau to that statement object, get a result set, which brings data back from the database, and then loop through it, and then print out all of the wins for each record. Now, there's only one record, so we should only see the number 30 get printed out when this runs. But hey, I'm from Missouri. I'm from the Show Me State. Let's say run as a Spring Boot application and see what happens. And boom, when it runs, we see the number 30 printed out. There's a bunch of other printouts there, but 30's in there. It all worked. We were able to query the database, get that information back. Now, a couple of things are required here. I've actually got on line 17 the Enable AutoConfiguration annotation. If you want to use AutoConfiguration, you've got to have that annotation on your code, on your class that runs, that gets picked up by Spring configuration. You can actually see on line 24 there, when we run the Spring application, we actually load in the AutoConfiguration MySQL connection class, which has that annotation on it. Now, a lot of people may have never actually seen that annotation, and there's a good reason why. And the reason for that is because if you've actually got an application that has the Spring Boot application annotation on it, which is what you'll get if you actually create a Spring Boot application using the Spring initializer, well, Spring Boot application actually includes Enable AutoConfiguration in it. It's one of the annotations that you get automatically if you create a Spring Boot application. So if I just click on that and say, hey, Spring, show me some of the documentation, you can see right up there on that Spring Boot application annotation source code that Enable AutoConfiguration is one of the annotations that you get by default when you create a Spring Boot application. Also, what else have you got in there? Component scan and inherited and documented. Enable AutoConfiguration is the one that's worthwhile here. So if you create a Spring Boot application and you've got an application that has Spring Boot application sprinkled on your main class there, on your entry class, well, then you get AutoConfiguration. But you can see right here, the code that I just ran, I actually just have Enable AutoConfiguration on the class. So people often say, do you have to use Spring Boot to use Enable AutoConfiguration? No, in fact, you can use that alone. There is an AutoConfiguration Maven project or Gradle coordinates you'd have to include in your POM file or Gradle build file. But if you include that, you can use AutoConfiguration with any Spring application. Now, this all looks magical, right? Oh, this magical data source just appeared from nowhere. Well, there's a couple of things going on behind the scenes. In order for this to work, I actually need to specify in a properties file, application.properties, that goes right under resources. I have to include, well, the database URL that I'm going to connect to. You can see that right there on line 2. And then the username and password for the database. And if that's inside of the application.properties file, when this code runs, what's going to happen is Spring is going to know, hey, you know, I've actually got a data source on my class path. I've got some information in a properties file about how to connect to a database. It's actually going to indicate that it's MySQL that's there in that data source URL. And what Spring's going to do is it's going to try and create for you a data source. And then anytime you auto-wire that data source into a piece of code, well, you'll be able to get connections to that underlying database. That's what's going on here with that auto configuration. Now, one thing I might also mention, just in order to get this to work, why don't we just quickly take a look at my POM file. I'm using a Maven project here. In order to connect to a MySQL database, you do need to have a database driver for MySQL installed in your class path. And you get that just by using the MySQL connector J dependency inside Maven, or add that to your Gradle build file. It's also worth noting here, you can see some of the dependencies that I'm using in this project. I'm using JDBC. I got DevTools, which I always put in there. And then, just the test starter, and then the Spring Boot starter itself. So there's not a whole lot of dependencies in this particular project that I'm using. Now let's go back to this code again. This all looks magic, and I know you're never supposed to reveal a magician's secrets, but what's going on here, it's awesome, but it's also pretty simple, and you could recreate this on your own. So here's another piece of code that I wrote. Here is AutoConfiguration working. You can see this working right here. Magically, we get the data source. The Spring just looks at this properties files and then creates one for us, injects it into the code, and then we use it in our run method. Well, here's a class that does exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same, except it's different. Here is a class, a Spring class, that is that main method where we load the class itself, not configured MySQL connection. So this is a Java class that is going to connect to a database, query that table, but it's not going to use AutoConfiguration. We put the configuration annotation on there saying that this class itself is going to be responsible for configuration. We won't do AutoConfiguration. And you can see in this class right at the bottom here, see if I can bring that up. Well, you can see we've just got this method, public data source, data source. It's annotated with a bean annotation. That bean annotation means that what gets returned from this method will be put into the Spring IOC container and become eligible for dependency injection at any point in time in the future. So by having this method here, we're actually going to create the data source ourselves. Rather than saying to Spring auto configure it, we're just going to say, like, I can write the code to get a data source. And that's what we do. Line 35, driver manager data source equals new driver manager. Set the driver class name. Set the URL, set the username, set the password. That's practically everything that was in that application properties file except for the driver name, right? And then from that method, we just say return data source. And when this code runs, it's going to behave exactly the same way that the one that was auto-configured was, right? That data source is going to get auto-wired in, because we've put the data source into the IOC container, the inversion of control container. So it's there. It's available for auto wiring. And so then when the run method runs, we say data source get connection, create statement, statement execute query, gives us the result set. We loop through the result set and we get the number of wins. And when we run this, we should see the number 30 in the output. So run that Java application, save everything, including that little formatting that we did. And boom, there you go. The number 30 is printed out there. So the point here is, yeah, when you use auto configuration, right, there's all sorts of neat things going on behind the scenes. What happens is Spring takes a look at your project. It takes a look at all the different classes on your class path. In this case, if you're using Spring JDBC, well, it takes a look to see if there's a data source on your class path, and if EnableAutoConfiguration is one of the annotations on your code. What it's going to do is it's going to look at the properties files for the URL, the username, and the password. It's going to create that data source and inject it in. So that's all cool. That's all magical. That gives us this class here that uses auto configuration. But as I said, the only difference is the code between lines 33 and 41, and the fact that this other class doesn't have enable auto configuration. It just has that configuration annotation on it. And there you go. That's us doing everything that auto configuration does behind the scenes, right? We just do it on our own. So I hope that demystifies it a little bit for you, right? Yeah, Spring is doing a few things that are interesting behind the scenes for us, but it's nothing that crazy. It's something that we can really do on our own. Okay, So that's the first introduction to auto configuration. What I want to do next is I want to show you all of the different things that can be auto configured, and there's almost 1,000 of them. From there, I actually want to show you how the code in Spring actually figures out whether something should be auto-configured or not. And then I even want to show you how to find out what's being auto-configured and what isn't being auto-configured. But taking a look at that auto-configuration and everything that's available to us from the Spring framework, that is what we're going to do next. Okay, next in our task of demystifying how Spring Enable Auto Configuration works, I want to first take a look at all of the different things that can be auto-configured in Spring, and I want to show you how the Spring code, how the Spring Boot application actually figures out which auto configurations to turn on and which ones not to. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to go over to the list of all my Maven dependencies inside of Eclipse. And one of those Maven dependencies is going to be Spring Boot Auto Configured. That's one of the dependencies that you have to add to your Maven POM file if you want to use auto configuration. Although if you're using Spring Boot, it comes in by default as part of the Spring parent package. Now, inside here, you'll actually see a meta-inf folder. Meta-inf? I don't know how you're supposed to say it, but meta-inf is right there. It is in Screaming Snake case, so maybe I'm supposed to shout it, but I'm not going to do that. And you'll notice in there that there's a Spring Auto Configure metadata properties. Open that up and scroll through the insanity that is Spring Boot Auto Configuration, Redis, Elasticsearch, GraphQL, HTTP, Jackson, JDBC, Jersey, JMS, Kafka. This is just crazy. There are 872 things that could be, they aren't all, but could be auto-configured in your Spring Boot application. So, I mean, check that out. It's actually pretty cool. It's actually pretty crazy when you go in and take a look at it. Now, only a small portion of those will be auto-configured when you run your Spring Boot application. Now, if you actually look in here, you actually see that, well, there's a listing of all sorts of different classes that will run and represent configuration. And each of those classes you can actually find inside of this jar file right here that's listed in Maven, Spring Boot Auto Configure. And I'm going to dig into a couple. I'm going to dig into one for Jackson. I'm going to dig into one for JSON, and I'm going to dig into one for configuring a data source, which we just did. The first one I want to take a look at is just the Jackson Auto Configuration class. I'm going to double click on that and take a look at the source code. And you'll notice right at the top of the class, it does have an auto configuration annotation on it. So this is a class that can do auto configuration. But more importantly, look at line 87 there. Conditional on class object mapper. When Spring Boot runs, this class is going to take a look and see if you've got object mapper.class anywhere in your class path. If you do, it's going to auto configure Jackson. It's going to turn this auto configuration on. If you don't, it'll leave it alone. And so each one of these auto configuration classes in all of these different packages, as you saw like almost 1,000 of them, they all have these list of conditions on them. They're not all as simple as that, but you can see right here, if you've got object mapper.class anywhere in your class path, this is going to auto configure and help you work with the Jackson APIs. JSON, right there's the auto configuration for JSON. This one says that, well, you got to have the JSON class somewhere on your class path. So if you've got that package, got that library listed in your Maven POM, it's on your class path, well, boom, all of a sudden the JSON auto configuration will kick in. Now, there's another one, conditional on class JSON, and enable auto configuration JSON properties that class. So when this runs, it's actually going to use a JSON properties file as well. You can actually see that there in the listing of that package. So that's another little entry that you can see on these auto configuration classes, and they build up previously we used the JDBC data source configuration. Now let's take a look at that one, data source auto configuration. Now this gets a little bit intimidating, but right up there you can see how this auto configuration figures out whether it should turn on or not. So first of all, conditional on these two classes. If you have data source.class and embedded database type.class on your class path, then data source auto configuration will be turned on. Now, I believe those come with the Spring Data JDBC. I think if you use Spring Data JPA, there's a bunch of different packages that require those. So if you're using any of those packages, boom, this auto configuration will turn on. If you're not, Spring just leaves this alone, right? If you're just doing some RESTful APIs, you're not doing any database stuff, this won't get turned on for you. Now, what else is on there? Conditional on missing bean. So this code will only auto configure itself if the connection factory bean doesn't already exist, right? So one of the things that happens when you auto configure an object is after the auto configuration is done, it gets stuffed into the IOC container so that it becomes eligible for dependency injection anywhere else in your code. So that actually says, look, if someone's already stuffed in a connection factory into the IOC container, then this work is already done, so we don't need it. So that's another condition there. Then there's also enable configuration properties. So this is going to use the data source properties class as well. Then it's got a couple of imports of classes that it's going to use. But that's how this figures out whether it should be turned on or not. It checks to see if data source or embedded database type is on the class path. Checks to see if the connection factory has already been stuffed into the IOC container. And then when it runs, it's going to use that enable data source properties class. Now, I don't want to dig too deep into here. Do it on your own time. It's actually interesting. But if you actually look at this data source properties class, you'll notice that it's really just referencing all of the stuff that I configured in my code earlier, right? When I configured my data source automatically, I had to specify the driver class name. I had to specify the URL. I had to specify the username, and I had to specify the password, right? There it is right there. That's the not configured MySQL connection class we looked at earlier where we did all of our configuration. And you can see right there, I'm setting the driver class name, the URL, the username, and the password. If we go back over to this data source, and specifically the properties class, well, you can see it's just grabbing all that information, grabbing it from the properties file, but it's just grabbing all that information as well. So there you go. That's how these work. That's how these configuration files work. They check to see if certain files are available on the class path when the application starts. And if certain conditions are met, well, then the auto configuration will go. If the conditions aren't met, well, then the thing doesn't get auto configured. It's just as simple as that. Now, the other thing you're probably interested in is just knowing what the heck is auto configured. There's an easy way to find that out. You just go to your project. I'm going to mosey on over here to my application.properties file and just slide in debug equals true. And your world will change. I'm going to start off my application again that did configuration. So auto configuration connection. I'm going to run this application. So run it as a Java application. Now I'm just going to get, the number 30 printed out like before, but I'm actually going to get a whole bunch of other information here. About 1,000 lines of information, which maps to the number of things that can be auto configured. So first of all, we end up with a listing of all of the positive matches. So what is auto configured here? So AOP is auto configured. Application availability auto configured. Data source auto configuration, right? In order to do dependency injection and get that data source auto wired, well, it figured out there was a data source class, there was application properties, so it turned that on. So this is a listing of all of the things that are turned on. Now, by the way, you actually have this property here. If you ever wanted to turn something off, right? So we've got AOP, aspect-oriented programming, auto configuration turned on. You know, if you wanted to be cheeky, you could always go to your application file and set that to false. And the next time we actually run our application, we would actually see that goes away. So we run it again just for the sake of posterity here. Let me bring up that console. And let's take a look at everything that was configured. And we'll come up here to positive matches. And ooh, look at that. Aspect-oriented programming is not there anymore. So one of the ways that you can make a positive match a negative match is by changing one of the properties there. And quite often in the positive negative match, will tell you which property to change. So we just turned off aspect-oriented program. So pretty easy. There's another way to do it by doing an exclusion. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. But yeah, you can take a look at here. I mean, I'm using the JDBC project, so you can see all sorts of persistence and JDBC stuff. The Spring Data JDBC dependency is what I've got. So yeah, so a lot of the stuff to deal with JDBC and database connections is enabled, transactions as well. Now the negative matches, this is stuff that didn't get enabled because there wasn't a match, and there's going to be a lot here. So there's caching, and there's Cassandra. I dated a girl named Cassandra. There's couch-based data source stuff for different types of connection pools, Groovy, JMX, JPA. I mean, my power grid just kind of went down for a second there as I'm scrolling down the list. There's so many darn ones here, but you get the idea, right? Those are all different ones. And then finally, there's unconditional classes that, well, just get loaded, and there's no conditions on them. They're just loaded all the time. But you'll also notice there's that little piece there for exclusions, right? So let's actually take a look at how exclusions work. If you want, you can actually exclude any of the auto configurations. And rather than just turning it on or turning it off with the property file, let's take a look at that aspect-oriented programming component that we turned off. We just turned that off by updating a property in the application properties file. Instead of doing it that way, what you can actually do is you can actually say, I just want to exclude this altogether. So I'm going to go to my AutoConfig application here, right? Use the enable AutoConfiguration, and I'm just going to type in exclude equals data source AutoConfiguration. That's the one we were just looking at a moment ago, right? That's the one that allowed us to do dependency injection with the data source. I'm going to say, hey, I want to turn that off. Now, by the way, if you're using Spring Boot and the Spring Boot application annotation, you can do the same thing with that. Control-Shift-O to organize my imports there. But you can put this on the Spring Boot application annotation. And of course, most people using Spring Boot will be using that annotation. But if you're just using Enable Auto Configuration, you can add it in there as well. Now I'm going to run this code. Now I'm going to tell you beforehand, this isn't going to work because my code is depending on a data source. And I just said, exclude the auto configuration for the data source. And as this runs, it's going to blow up, right? It's going to die. So let's do this. Run as a Java application, and it's printing everything out. And then finally, look at that. Hey, consider your life choices here, because I couldn't find that data source class. So consider revisiting the entries above or defining a bean of type java.sql.dataSource in your configuration. Application failed to start, and you can just see the whole stack trace there, right? And that's because my application depends on auto configuration, and I just said, hey, exclude the data source auto configuration, and it removes it. Now, by the way, if I actually wanted to take that code that I put in there just a little earlier, where I define my own bean, right, and throw it in here now, right, I can say, hey, I don't want to use the auto configuration. I want to do my own customizations on this class, right? So exclude the data source configuration, but I want to do it on my own. Hey, all the power to you. Right click, run as a Java application. So even though we've excluded data source auto configuration, I'm actually going to configure one on my own, and boom, all of a sudden that 30 gets printed out because, as we saw before, there are 30 wins in that database, and that's what we're going after in this code. System.out.println rs.getString wins. So there you go. That is how you can turn auto configuration on. That's how you can turn it off, or at least select which elements you want to auto configure, which elements you want to turn off. It shows you how to figure out all the things that could be auto configured, and it gives you a list of what is actually being auto configured in your environment. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a deeper dive. Now, the last thing I'm going to do, and I think this is really cool, is I'm going to actually create an auto configuration of my own. So we don't want Kafka queues, we want Cameron queues. So I'm going to create a Cameron queue, and I'm going to throw that Cameron queue into the IOC container at initialization. And I'm going to then pull that out with dependency injections, all going to be done by having me create my very own auto configure object. And that is what we're going to do next. So I think we're all experts now at how auto configuration works, right? When Spring boots up, it's got a list of things that could be auto configured. We go through all these classes, we check to see if conditions are correct, and if they are, Spring Boot will create a resource and stuff it into the IOC container, and once in the IOC container, it's eligible for dependency injection in the future. It's just that easy. But you know, one of the questions I ask is, why does Spring get to have all the fun? Why can't we stuff things into that IOC container on our own? And the thing is, you can, and that's what I want to show you how to do. I want to show you how to create your own auto configuration. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stuff a queue into the IOC container, not a Kafka queue, but a Cameron queue. And so I'm just going to create a brand new class here that's just going to be the resource. It's going to be called Cameron's queue. I'll click finish there, and I don't know, throw in a little constructor, public Cameron's queue, and I'll just do system.out.println and say inside the constructor. That'll just be interesting to see when that constructor gets fired off. But I do want to have a real method to call. And the method here will be public. It'll be void. It'll be called list services. I don't know. Get the queue. I don't know. QUEUE. It's just some method. And then when we say get the queue, system.out.println. Here is Cameron's queue. And there we go. We'll just print out a queue. We're not going to get too deep here, okay? I'm just printing out the letter Q. You can deal with your own connections to topics and message queues on your own. I just want to keep this simple. But this is the class we want to have stuffed into the IOC container right when the application starts up. Now, that means we have to actually create an auto configuration class, and that's what we're going to do next. I'm going to create a new class called Cameron's queue auto configuration. Try and spell that correctly. That looks pretty good to me. Okay, so I'll click finish there. So I'm creating my own class. It's going to be a Spring Boot auto configuration class. So you got to throw in that auto configuration annotation there. Now, I do have do you see the red X there? If you see a red X there, you need to get your eyes checked, because that is a white X on a red square. But if you see that red X there, just because I haven't imported my import, so Control-Shift-O, that's imported. Okay, I'm off to a good start. I've created my base class here. Now, I want to actually have some sort of class here that can run and can actually create this queue for me. So inside this auto configuration class, I'm going to do something sneaky. I'm going to create a public static class, and I'm going to call it Cameron's configuration. Okay, and inside this static class, I'm going to have a public method that returns Cameron's queue. Okay. So it's going to return Cameron's queue, and it'll call some queue service or something like that. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to return a new Cameron's queue. Okay, so this is an important method because what this method is going to do is it's going to return an instance of Cameron's queue to the IOC container when auto configuration happens, and it's that instance that's going to get shoved into the IOC container and become available for dependency injection. We only want to shove that into the IOC container if the IOC container doesn't already have one. And so in order to do that, we just throw in the conditional on missing bean annotation, Control-Shift-O. Okay, and it is a configuration class here, so we actually do want to have a bean annotation on there too. But we're going to say, okay, this method is going to generate a bean that we want to stuff into the IOC container. And specifically, we only want to shove this into the IOC container if the bean isn't already in there, because we only need one of Cameron's queue. Now, one is more than enough. Now, when does this run? Well, if this runs and the class Cameron's queue doesn't exist, we're in a world of hurt because you can't create an instance of a class that doesn't exist. So we want to decorate this with a good old conditional on class and say this should only run if Cameron's queue class is available, sitting there on the class path. So I don't know, I think this is looking pretty good. We've got an auto configuration class, which contains a static class that has this method that creates a new Cameron's queue for us. We'll only shove that into the IOC container if the IOC container doesn't already have one. And we're only going to run this class and run this method if that Cameron's queue class is somewhere on our class path. Now, we do have to help out the IOC container in terms of creating proxies and stuff. So we say configuration proxy bean methods equals false. Okay, so it's just a requirement on there. Control-Shift-O to make sure that all works swimmingly. And we're almost done, right? So there is Cameron's queue, right? That's just the class that we're going to shove into the IOC container. This could be anything. It could be a database connection. It could be a data source. It could be a queue. Now, obviously, there's auto configurations for those already, but perhaps it is a connection to your GitLab server. Perhaps it is a connection to some custom resource that you have that you need to have available when your application starts up. You can create an auto configuration here that starts up and shoves that resource into the IOC container for anybody else to use through dependency injection. Now, what do I have to do next in order to get this to work? Now, I'm going to do a little comment up here just to make my life a little bit easier. I have to tell Spring about this particular class. I got to do the full package and class name. So I'm just copying that for future use. Now, before we saw that there was this huge listing over here of all of the different classes that could be auto-configured. So we essentially have to put in there a reference to this class, but that's read-only. We can't go in there. We can't head over into the Spring classes and start making edits. We have to do things inside of our own project. So what we have to do right now is we have to create a meta INF folder over here in our project. So we'll go into Java, create a new folder called meta INF. And just in case you didn't catch my Canadian pronunciation there, I pronounce those with all uppercase letters. So I'm going to create that. And now I got to create a file. And here's the file's name. It's crazy. It's org.springframework.boot.autoconfigured.autoconfiguration.import. And there we go. Click finish. That creates the file. And now where the heck was that? There is. Now I got to throw that in here. Okay, so this file here is going to take the place of that great big long listing of files. It's going to get, it's going to allow this auto configuration to essentially get added to the bottom of that list. We can't go in and edit the Spring framework, right? This essentially allows us to tell Spring Boot to pay attention to the Cameron's Q auto configuration class. That is in the meta INF folder. That looks good here. That's in the auto configuration class. Okay, life is good. I think this is pretty close to being done. I guess the next thing to do is to actually just use it, right? So I've got this class that was created with this project. So this project was called AutoConfig Made Easy. And so there's the AutoConfig Made Easy application. This is actually the class that gets created with the Spring Boot application. I was trying to use my own custom classes so that you could see the Enable Auto Configuration annotation without the Spring Boot application annotation. But as we saw before, right, that annotation there includes Enable Spring Boot Configuration. And what I want to do is, well, in this code, as it runs, well, I want to be able to inject an instance of Cameron's Q into the code. I want to auto-wire it. And auto-wired, here we go, Control-Shift-O. Right, because when we start up the application, that's going to be auto-configured and shoved into the IOC container. If that auto-configuration works, I should be able to gain access to it from here. Now, I actually want to be able to run this code. So I'm going to implement the command line runner. Okay, so that allows me to have like a runnable Spring application. I got an error there because there's a method I have to implement. Do you see that red X there? Just trolling you. Okay, add those unimplemented methods and right down here, there we go. We got a place where we can write some code. Now, Cameron's Q, what it printed out that stupid message about a queue, right? So when it runs, I should be able to say system.out.println, or no, actually, if I look at Cameron's Q does the printing on its own. So in fact, this is going to be even easier. I should be able to just call this auto-wired object and call its getTheQ method. Right? And then that should print out that little message there, right? And of course, when that gets created, we should see the call to the constructor as well. Okay, that's it. That's how easy it is to create your own auto configuration, right? There's an object somewhere that you're going to want to throw into the IOC container. You go in and you create this class. You specify the conditions on when it runs. You specify that it should only be thrown into the IOC container when the IOC container doesn't already have one. You go in and you specify that you want this to be part of the auto configuration, and then you can come over here to your code, save everything, right click, say run as a Java application. I'm going to open up this console window right here. We're inside the constructor, so things look good. I did see that message, and then finally it says, here is Cameron's Q, and troll face, we print out the letter Q. But that is being printed out through auto configuration, right? We've done that whole auto configuration. We've said throw that into the IOC container when you start up, and if that class is available there, and then we took advantage of it inside of that method. So there you go. That is everything I know about Spring's Enable Auto-Wired annotation, and I think that's probably all you need to know to go a really, really long way with this tool. Now, by the way, if you enjoyed that tutorial, there's going to be a link in the description on where you can get the source code and how you can get that. So check that out. I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but I am the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com. I've got lots of great tutorials on Spring, on Spring Boot, on Hibernate, JPA, Git, GitHub, you name it. And I've also written a few books. You can see a few books behind me there. What is WebSphere doesn't sell too many copies, but Hibernate Made Easy might be of interest to some people doing Hibernate. There's a book called Pickering is Springfield, all about the Simpsons. And I also helped do some final edits on Darcy DeClute's Scrum Master Certification Guide. So a lot of people are purchasing that book and scoring 100% on the Product Owner and Scrum Master Certification exam. So if you're agile and you're doing Scrum, and you want to enhance your career, definitely check that out. It's available on Amazon. And of course, finally, if you're interested in me, you can follow me on Twitter at CameronMCNZ. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I'd love to see a message in the comments, or tweet at me on Twitter. And then finally, if you're watching this on YouTube, why don't you just subscribe on YouTube?